You may have heard the sermon, "The Church Replaced Israel." It floats through study Bible footnotes, hangs over 1,000 quiet sermons, and lives in 1,000 small assumptions about what the new covenant means. The old promises were for them. The new promises are for us. The first ended when the curtain tore. The second is the one we live in now. It is one of the most quietly repeated teachings in Western Christianity, and it is one of the most directly contradicted teachings in the New Testament. In a single chapter, in Romans chapter 11, the Apostle Paul gives the doctrine of replacement a name. He calls it arrogance. He says it like he is angry. And then he spends 36 verses dismantling it with an olive tree, a Greek verb that no farmer would ever use, and a word the Greek scholars translate as mystery. Today, we are going to walk through that chapter slowly. We will look at the Greek where Paul makes his case. We will see why he reaches for a remnant, why he reaches for a tree, and why he reaches, at the very end, for a doxology so overwhelming that the apostle, who has just written 11 chapters of careful argument, simply puts his pen down and starts to worship. By the end, you will never read the words, "All Israel will be saved," the same way again, because you will see what Paul was actually saying. And what he was actually saying matters more than almost anyone has admitted, not because replacement theology is a small mistake, but because if Paul was right, then the God you read about in Romans is a God who keeps his promises in a way the church has spent 2,000 years quietly underestimating. And that changes how you read every covenant in Scripture. Every single one. Let us start where Paul starts. The 11th chapter of Romans does not come out of nowhere. It is the climax of a 3-chapter argument that begins in Romans 9, where Paul opens with one of the most personal sentences in any of his letters. "I have great sorrow and continual grief in my heart," he writes, "for I could wish that I myself were accursed from Christ for my brethren, my countrymen according to the flesh." That is Paul speaking about Israel, the man who wrote half the New Testament saying he would trade his own salvation if it meant Israel would receive the Messiah. Romans 9 asks why most of Israel rejected Jesus. Romans 10 explains why the gospel went out to the Gentiles. And then Romans 11 asks the question those 2 chapters raise. If Israel rejected the Messiah and the gospel has now gone to the nations, is Israel finished? Did God change his mind? Did the old covenant end? These are not abstract theological questions for Paul. The man writing this letter is a Pharisee turned apostle, born of the tribe of Benjamin, who once persecuted the followers of Jesus for what he believed was the sake of Israel. He has now spent a decade and a half watching most of his own people reject the very Messiah he is convinced has come. He is not writing as a theorist. He is writing as someone whose own flesh and blood is on the other side of the question, and he refuses to let that question go unanswered. Paul opens chapter 11 with the same question in his own words. Romans 11 verse 1. "I say then, has God cast away his people? Certainly not. For I also am an Israelite, of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin." Read the Greek behind that, "certainly not." The phrase is me genoito, and it is the strongest possible denial in New Testament Greek. It does not mean no, it means may it never be. It is the response a Greek-speaking lawyer would use to dismiss a wrong interpretation of his own argument before anyone else could draw it. Paul uses me genoito 14 times in his letters, almost always to shut down a misreading. And here, at the opening of Romans 11, he uses it to shut down replacement theology before it has even been named. Notice what he does next. He names himself first. "For I also am an Israelite, of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin." Paul is exhibit A. If God has cast away his people, he has cast away the man writing this letter, the man who saw the resurrected Christ on the road to Damascus. The man who has spent his entire apostolic ministry building churches across the Roman world. If Israel is finished, then Paul is finished. And Paul knows that is absurd, so he asks the question. He denies it with the strongest denial available to him. He names himself as the living counterexample. And then he begins to build the argument. The argument takes 36 verses. But before Paul builds the case, he reaches back into the Old Testament, to Elijah. To a moment most readers skip past in 1 Kings 19. Picture Elijah on Mount Horeb. He has just won the great showdown against the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. Fire from heaven, the people falling on their faces, the prophets of Baal slaughtered in the Kishon Valley. And 40 days later, he is hiding in a cave, asking God to let him die. I alone am left, he says. Even I only, am left. And God's answer is one of the most quietly devastating sentences in the Hebrew Bible. Yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal. Paul quotes that line in Romans 11, verse 4. He uses it as the foundation of the next 30 verses, Romans 11, verses 5 and 6. Even so then, at this present time, there is a remnant according to the election of grace. And if by grace, then it is no longer of works. Otherwise, grace is no longer grace. The Greek word translated remnant is one of the most theologically loaded words in the New Testament. In Greek, the word is leimma, Strong's 3005. It comes from the verb lepo, which means to leave behind. A leimma is what remains when most of something has been taken away. The crumbs after the loaf, the thread after the cloth has worn through. The few who are still standing when the storm has passed. The Hebrew root behind it is shesrit, used more than 65 times in the Old Testament. Isaiah names his own son Shear-Jashub. A remnant will return. Jeremiah writes about a remnant returning from Babylon. Micah, Zephaniah, Zechariah. Every prophet uses the word, and every time the message is the same. The visible state of unbelief is never the totality. There is always a faithful core that God has preserved. That is what Paul is saying. There has always been a remnant of Israel that received the covenant. Today, in his own century, that remnant includes the apostles, the early Jewish believers in Jerusalem, Paul himself, and the thousands of Jews who responded to Peter's first sermon at Pentecost. The remnant is real. The remnant is named. The remnant is not the church taking Israel's place. It is the faithful inside Israel that has always existed. That is not a church that replaced Israel. That is a remnant of Israel that received its own Messiah first. And if you have ever felt like Elijah, like the last faithful one in your family, in your office, in your generation, Paul's argument is also for you. There has never been a moment in covenant history when God did not have his 7,000. You are not the first to feel alone. You are not the first to have been wrong about how alone you actually are. And here is something most readers never notice. The remnant is not the whole answer. Now, here is something the surface reading buries. Paul could have stopped at the remnant. He could have said, there is a faithful core of Israel that received the Messiah. The rest fell away. That is the end of the story. That would have been a clean theological answer. It would have explained the visible facts, and it would have been wrong. So Paul goes further, Romans 11, verse 11. I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? Certainly not. There it is again, me genoito. The double denial. Paul has now used his strongest possible refusal twice in 11 verses, because he is anticipating exactly the wrong interpretation people will draw. Yes, most of Israel stumbled over the Messiah. But no, the stumbling is not the falling. The stumbling is not the end. Listen to how he reasons through it. Verse 11 continued. But through their fall, to provoke them to jealousy, salvation has come to the Gentiles. That sentence is doing more than it looks like it is doing. Paul is saying Israel's temporary rejection of the Messiah is the very mechanism by which the gospel reached the rest of the world. The crucifixion was the trigger that broke the door open for the nations, and the Gentile mission has a purpose for Israel, to provoke them to jealousy. Paul is honest about his own work, verses 13 and 14. For I speak to you, Gentiles, inasmuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry, if by any means I may provoke to jealousy those who are my flesh, and save some of them. His apostleship to the Gentiles is not separate from his love for Israel. It is the strategy by which Israel will be reached. That is not the end of Israel. That is the means by which Israel returns. And then comes verse 15, and verse 15 is a sentence that should shake any reading of Romans 11. For if their being cast away is the reconciling of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? Read that twice. If Israel's temporary rejection brought reconciliation to the entire planet, what happens when Israel returns? Paul's answer is not more reconciliation. Paul's answer is anastasis ek nekron, life from the dead, resurrection itself. Whatever Paul is talking about in Romans 11, he is talking about something so large that the only category he has for it is the resurrection. Replacement theology cannot survive Romans 11:15. The verse is a logical bomb under the entire framework. If Israel's stumbling produced reconciliation, then Israel's restoration produces resurrection. The reconciliation is what we are living in now. The resurrection is still ahead. And it depends on something Israel still has to do. This is the moment in the chapter where you can feel Paul tightening his grip. He is not making a passing remark. He is laying down the architecture of his entire argument. Verses 11 through 15 do something that almost no other passage in the New Testament does. They tell you that what Gentile Christians are experiencing right now is not the end of the story, it is the middle. And the end is something neither the church nor Israel can produce by itself. And the next image Paul reaches for is not a doctrine, it is a tree. Let me show you something about that tree. Romans 11 verses 16 and 17. If the root is holy, so are the branches. And if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them became a partaker of the root and fatness of the olive tree. Paint the picture. A cultivated olive tree. The root is the patriarchal covenant. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. The natural branches are the children of Israel. Some of those branches have been broken off, the ones who rejected the Messiah. And in their place, wild olive branches have been grafted in, Gentile believers. And they are now drawing life from the same patriarchal root. That is the metaphor. And the Greek word Paul uses for grafted in is the most theologically interesting verb in the chapter. In Greek, the word is enkentrízō, Strong's 1461. It literally means to stab into, to insert by piercing. Paul uses this word 6 times in Romans 11, and he uses it nowhere else in the entire New Testament. But here is what makes this strange. Real grafting, actual horticulture, works the opposite direction. If you are an olive farmer in the 1st century Mediterranean, you do not graft a wild branch into a cultivated tree. You do the reverse. You take a cultivated branch, a branch that has been bred to produce good fruit, and you graft it into a wild root, because the wild root is hardy and the cultivated branch is fertile. That is how grafting works. That is how it has always worked. Paul knew this. He wrote this metaphor to a Roman audience that lived on olive oil. Every farmer reading this letter would have caught the inversion immediately, and Paul uses enkentrízō backwards on purpose. He is saying, what God is doing here is not natural, it is grace. The wild branches do not deserve to be there. The cultivated branches were always going to be on the tree because they belong on it. The root belongs to the patriarchs. The tree belongs to the covenant. And if you, a Gentile believer, are now drawing life from that root, it is because God did something against horticulture, against expectation, against your deserving. Romans 11 verse 18, do not boast against the branches, but if you do boast, remember that you do not support the root, but the root supports you. And if your reading of Paul has ever made you feel like the church owns the tree, this verse is the correction. That is not replacement, that is engrafting. Verses 23 and 24 close the metaphor. And they also, if they do not continue in unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. For if you were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, who are natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? Read the structure. The wild branches grafted in, that is the harder miracle. The natural branches grafted back, that is the easier one. If God did the harder thing, God can do the easier thing. Which brings Paul to the part he says he cannot let his readers miss. And then Paul does something unusual. He stops the argument. And he addresses his reader directly, Romans 11, verse 25. For I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinion, that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Notice the move. Paul has been reasoning, quoting, defending, explaining. And now he interrupts himself. I do not want you to be ignorant of this. He is signaling that what comes next is what the entire chapter has been building toward. In Greek, the word mystery is mystérion. Strong's 3466. And it does not mean what the English word mystery usually means today. A mystérion in Paul's letters is not a puzzle. It is not something unknown. It is a sacred truth that was hidden for centuries in the Old Testament and is now being unveiled in the New Covenant. Paul uses mystérion 21 times across his letters. Every time, the structure is the same. Here is something God kept silent about for ages. Now, I am telling you what it is. Listen carefully. And in Romans 11, the mystérion is this, verses 25 and 26. Blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved. Paul does not say most. Paul does not say the elect among. Paul writes pas Israel, all Israel. What Paul means by all Israel is one of the most debated phrases in the New Testament. Some Christian traditions read it as all elect Jewish believers across history. Some read it as the literal nation of Israel at the end of the age. Some read it as the spiritual Israel composed of Jews and Gentiles together. The text does not settle that debate, and we are not here to settle it for you. But what the text does settle is this. Paul did not see Israel as canceled. Whatever he meant by all Israel will be saved, he did not mean the church takes Israel's place. That reading is the exact one he just spent 25 verses dismantling. And if you have read the New Testament thinking the Old Testament story is over, this verse is your invitation to read it again. The chapter does not stop there. Verses 28 and 29. Concerning the gospel, they are enemies for your sake, but concerning the election, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. That last word in Greek is ametameletos. It means God will not change his mind. Cannot, will not, has not. The Greek tense is the same one used for the irrevocability of God's covenants throughout the New Testament. That is not the ending of Israel's story. That is the climax of it. And then Paul does something the most theological book in the Bible has not seen him do before. For 11 chapters, Paul has been building an argument about sin and grace, about Jew and Gentile, about Adam and Christ. He has reasoned, he has quoted, he has anticipated objections, he has refused replacement theology in 2 words of Greek used twice. And then, at the end of chapter 11, the most analytical writer in the New Testament does something he does almost nowhere else. He stops arguing, and he starts worshiping. Romans 11, verse 33. Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out! That is what happens when you actually take Romans 11 seriously. The argument becomes too big to defend. The grace becomes too wide to contain. The only honest response left is doxology, the doxology of a man who realized that the God who refused to abandon Israel is the same God who will not abandon him. And maybe that is the part that should stay with us. The covenant Paul could not finish writing about without worshiping is the same covenant we have been grafted into. God has not changed his mind about them or about us. If this opened the New Testament up for you in a new way, the biggest thing you can do is subscribe, leave a comment, even one word, and share this video with someone who has been told the Old Testament is over. That is genuinely how people find this content. Keep us in your prayers. God bless you.